Hello everyone and welcome to Tuesday Masters. Now, before we go ahead and rock and roll, there are a couple of updates. Now, I very much appreciate the help. So updates. A lot of things are happening in the chess world, so I thought I'm gonna start with that. Gukesh, Norway chess, not the hottest start ever. 0-2, 2 losses. Now, what's interesting is that people just have an image of their own hero, their chess heroes, and who they equate to. But in reality, it's not the person who you necessarily expect them to be similar. So, of course, we all know Gukesh became one of the youngest world champions. But do you remember if Carlsen ever quit a candidate's cycle? Is there a moment where he said, nah, I don't think so?
It was way back when, wasn't it? Like 15 years ago or so.
Exactly. Ben is correct, and that's correct. Yep, everyone knows. Natasha also knows. Correct. In fact, Carlsen, age 19, I did a bit of digging, quit the candidates tournament. And so I didn't do the shallow AI digging of giving you false information and be happy with myself. I actually did a thorough one, and he decided to quit because, drumroll, he hated the format. He did not like the format. He didn't want to play matches, and in fact wanted to have the round robins that, you know, kept crapping into that system and just was a thing. So he actually quit at 19. The reason I'm saying this and why I think this is an important knowledge is that, in fact, Carlsen could have become world champion at age 19. But he decided not to participate in that event where it was matches, knockout matches, kind of something that was around the Soviet Union times, 80s, 70s, when they played those long drawn-out matches of 4, and then you qualify for the match. These were played in Kazan, Russia, and they were games of 4. He didn't participate and didn't partake in that one. But that's, again, a great point, chat. Everyone's on fire today. That's great. Must be the weather. Maybe not. But he was already number 1. So that's why I thought, well, okay. So one thing that's similar, that Carlsen could have been a world champion much earlier. But compared to Gukesh, he was already number 1 on the list and actually won plenty of events, super tournaments that is. Now, Gukesh broke in to the chess world and became sort of a famous player at which event? Does anyone remember? It's been long ago by now, long ago. It may not surprise you that you don't remember, because it's not that typical tournament where you sort of shine that much. It was at the Chess Olympiad. Gukesh's first breakthrough event was the Chess Olympiad, where he scored amazingly. Unluckily for India, they lost to Uzbekistan and therefore only finished second place, only in air quotes. But that's actually a good way of starting out. There was another chess player who broke into the chess circuit and started out his chess career with playing an incredible and fantastic performance at the Chess Olympiad. And you'd think it's not the person you think of. It might surprise you, there was another player. So apart from Gukesh, this is sort of a trivia question, Gukesh broke through at the Olympiad, but the same thing happened with this player, and this player also became a world champion. No, Nodirbek, well, of course he made a breakthrough, but he didn't become a world champion yet. No, we're talking about the classical world championship. That's a valid point, but we're talking about the world champion. So had a breakthrough event, became chess world champion in classical chess. It's Kraemer. Yes, exactly. Well done. Do you know by any chance which Olympiad he was? No? It wasn't a bad guess, but it was in Manila, 92. And interestingly enough, as far as I know, 10 out of 11. So believe it or not, the two world champions we have who had their breakthroughs at the chess Olympiads is Gukesh and Kraemer. And by that definition, and yes, that was still with Kasparov on that team, they actually have much more similar trajectories and dissimilar to the trajectory of Carlsen's. Because if you remember, at that time, and Kraemer becomes a top 10 player in the 90s, does he become number one quickly? No, of course not. We have Kasparov. So, in fact, there is something very similar happening here. Kraemer has a breakthrough, becomes a top 10 player, but of course there's still some household names. Ivanchuk, Dreyev, and the list goes on. And of course Kasparov, Karpov at the top. Right now, it is fairly similar. We already have household names at the top. So even though Gukesh made a breakthrough, he's not number one on the list yet. Well, we'll see, but at least not at the moment. So we have, of course, Carlsen, we've got Hikaru, we've got some new names, but, you know, there's still a stronghold of Hikaru, Carlsen, Fabiano, Caruana up there. Now, of course, there are new names also coming up. So, in this sense, when people are very impatient with Gukesh, actually Kraemer had a bit of time. In fact, it's been like a decade till he sort of consolidated his spot at the top. So even though he became a top player, he didn't become number one so quickly when there was already someone in front. It's very difficult in these systems to actually rank up when someone's in front of you and they already have a very high rating, because you're trying to keep your rating and sort of add to it. But it's getting more and more difficult, especially when you run into some really tough opposition. And as I mentioned to chat, I meant classical world champion. Now, fret not, Gukesh, of course, will have his chances, but there is still one thing that I think is sort of like the Carlsen era and story. Carlsen could have become a world champion as well, but in that sense, Carlsen would have been under pressure. And now with Gukesh suddenly becoming world champion, and I think in some sense, Carlsen willingly avoided becoming and burdened with the title. I think that was one of the reasons why he didn't go at age 19 to play in the candidates and do this accidentally winning the event. Because let's be clear, there is a reason why Gukesh is struggling so far. He is actually facing a field which is way more experienced than he is. It doesn't mean he doesn't belong there. It means that they have 10 plus years of playing the top. Gukesh, on the other hand, didn't have that experience yet. So he actually had a wonderful run at that World Championship match, and of course the candidates, but that is something that he will have to go through this battle-hardened training that Carlsen had before he was going and shooting for the title. Carlsen actually went for the title match as a favorite, rating favorite, and of course #1 in the world. So what Gukesh is sort of suffering through, that he is not considered to be the favorite, not even on paper. So the question will be how he handles this, and he might actually have to change his style. But that's a completely different story. Now, I actually brought a game from, again, a nice and young generation. And this game is between Kraemer and Keymer. What a lucky choice by me. And Keymer actually had a wonderful run in this German championship. And Keymer is, of course, the promise of Germany. His main issue might still be that his style does not give him enough wiggle room to be much more successful. I think that his opening knowledge is fairly limited. So when you'll be guessing the opening, I don't think you'll have a hard time. I heard people calling Gukesh a field champion 6 months into his reign. Well, Gukesh is actually just having a tough time because of the situation. He probably became world championship early, when others usually don't break through this early on, so they don't have to build the armor. So he sort of became a champion before the invincibility armor has been built. He's still sort of a target, and people still believe that they can beat him. That wasn't the case with Kasparov. That wasn't the case with Carlsen. They were already in this mindset that they're most likely not going to beat either of them. They don't have this same opinion with Gukesh, and that's why Gukesh's journey is going to be incredibly difficult. Well, he's young. He can possibly do it, but it's going to be tougher than for the rest. Okay, but back to our game at hand. So e4, c6. Who would have thunk that Keymer is going to play the Caro-Kann? Anyone knows who's coaching Keymer? Banco sadly passed on a little bit, but definitely a fantastic player in his time. Leiko. Nah, it's fine. So it's Leiko, who's coaching Vincent Keymer. So Caro-Kann doesn't really come as a surprise. Also is a big e5 player at times. So d4, d5, e5. Now many people started playing c5, but the main line is still bishop to f5. This is the main variation. Knight f3, e6, bishop e2, knight d7, castles. So this is, of course, still the beginning of everything, is the beginning part of the opening. But even here, especially when you get a close position like this, you want to sort of decide the direction of your play. So the first question I want to ask y'all, where should black be focusing their play? He only plays the Caro, sorry. He only plays the Caro. No, as I said, he plays the Spanish as well.
Black should want to play in the center and on the queen side. He has his pawns sort of, pointing towards the queen side, and c5 is a strong break.
Yes. So black definitely wants to play on the queen side. Is there a reason why we want to do so?
His pawns are pointing towards the queen side. Also, his bishop is on a pretty good back.
For one, of course, there are targets here. And also, in general, it has this French vibes to it. This whole position has this French vibes. And even though at first blink you'd feel, well, wait a second, those pawns on c2, d4, especially once white goes, let's say, pawn to c3, that you have a wonderful structure. But that is not really so, because once I undermine you here and I do a trade, that pawn is actually going to get isolated. And once that pawn drops, so does the e5 pawn become a weakness. So in this sense, black has a long-term idea of undermining the center. Now, of course, it's easier said than done, but that is sort of the main point. Now here, black plays this very interesting little move of pawn to a5. Pawn to a5, I actually played this first, and I played this against Shimanov. Very, very interesting move. Care to guess what's the idea behind it? Well, of course, we're playing on the queen side. But what could be some other idea with a5?
Maybe black intends to prevent white from playing b4 eventually.
Maybe.
If you get on, you play h4.
A4, that is?
h4. Oh.
Mm-hmm. And what would you...
So, the question is, how is white going to develop his queen side? If you go knight c3, you sort of run into c5, and there's no pawn at c3. Which leads me to believe that knight d2 is sort of the desired path for the knight. Once you're on d2, where do you go?
Well,
going to b3, run into a4.
I mean, that's correct. If b3, there's a4. But knight c3 is not as silly as it looks, and in fact was played in the game. Because if c5, anytime you make a pawn push, there's a downside. Oftentimes this pawn ends up on a6 because knight c3, c5, I have knight b5 ideas. So, and this, even though looks silly, it isn't so, because you can't get rid of my pony at all. My knight is incredibly solid.
There's no knight e7.
Yeah, of course there's mate if you put anything there, yes. But also it's just a very nice spot controlling that square and fighting for a key square on d6. All that said, knight d2 is also fairly normal. What do we think about pawn to a4? Would that be a decent move for white?
It's like an essential, like if you're playing a blitz game, you can play a4 just not to calculate and stuff.
Yeah, a4 is very blitzy. But what could be the downside of just immediately going a4?
You might weaken the b4 square.
So what white is often going for is eventually trying to blow everything up with c4 in the position. But if you go e4 and pair it up with c4, black actually gets a control of a pivotal square. And in that sense, black gets a lot of control. Let's say I go here, takes, look at this. Suddenly, my knights will have a lot of play on those squares. When before, if the pawn could go backwards, which will be my favorite new form of chess, backwards pawn chess, where pawns can go backwards. Now this would be beautiful because you could stop these knight b4 jumps. Here it's not possible, according to classical chess. Black has a comfortable play here. b3, of course, a4, which is very nice. But the main idea, of course, is for black trying to gain space as much as possible. Bishop d2, a3, b3. So, first part of our job is done. But the question really hinges on the fact that, okay, we managed to take a lot of space, but what about time? Should we be worried about time? It's a close position. Exactly. So we have time. If it was open, this a5, a4, a3 would be just ridiculous. It's not a plan that you can use. But because of the nature of this close position, it's possible. And now this is actually a tough thing to consider in these French/Caro-Kann positions, how to organize your pieces without them getting into each other's ways. Now, first of all, it's always a good start recognizing our strongest piece. The bishop on f5 is by far the strongest. That in mind, what should we do? What if I go here? Knight h4, very good. Knight h4, and your bishop is trapped. And that's sort of a difference between Grandmaster and lower ranked players thinking Grandmaster wouldn't give up this bishop forever. Never. This is a concession. It's already a big deal at Keymer's level. You gave up your best piece. You don't want to do that. So therefore, he does the prophylactic move of h6, making sure this bishop can always retreat. Rook c1, knight e7. So if knight h4, of course, black has bishop h7. Okay, so it's time for white to decide something. What do you think white should be aiming for? And I know it's tough because not all of you play these type of positions, but that's what chess is. You want to figure out positions on the fly. If you actually watched some games from Norway chess, you've seen just because computers or AI is shouting someone's winning doesn't mean that the players know what's happening. And even if they sense it, just being in the arena is only something Grandmaster commentators can explain to you. AI can't. Not yet and not ever. We kind of hinted at of what white should be doing. And then we'll see what Kraemer decided to do.
Well, we discussed c4 earlier. If we want to play c4, then I guess we would have to go knight b1 first.
Okay, knight b1, c4 is interesting.
Could there also be the idea, because knight e7 was played, right? So we can go knight h4 and then bishop h7. Could there be some ideas with like f4 intending f5?
Well, for the moment, you know knight h4, bishop h7, f4. I mean, mathematically, I've got a lot of people blocking you. You can try to go knight h4, f4, but your breakthrough with f5 for the moment is highly unlikely.
Could we go g4 as well? My idea is like the king is still in the center for black, and I like it's a closed position. The value of time is diminished, but there's still almost something like, I don't know, maybe philosophical or something spiritual going on here, where we feel like it should be able that we can.
Yeah, but you are pushing it because you are pushing pawns in front of your king. Of course, I don't mean f4, but whenever you play g4, even if, philosophically speaking, it looks fine, you always should be careful. And in this sense, the classical grandmasters of the 60s, 70s do apply. Tread carefully with those pawns.
What about knight a4?
Knight a4, that's also very good. And what's your idea?
Well, I do want to blow up the center before black castles. And we also get control of c5 with that knight, which is better than tucking it and back rank.
In fact, both knight b1 and knight a4 would be pretty good. White decided to go h3, which is fine as well. Knight e1 is an idea. And here's again one thing that I keep repeating, but I think it's something that has to be said. Just because they don't play your move, it doesn't always mean that they know it better. There is this level of stress of playing chess. And again, whenever people just say, hey, I can do commentary with a computer open, that doesn't really give you the stress of being at the board and trying to figure out something. Just because you are in a competitive mindset means you are going to see something that you would otherwise not see and miss some stuff you otherwise wouldn't consider. So whenever a battle-hardened grandmasters give you commentary, let's say Levon, you will get insights you will not get with a person who just clicks at the computer. Why? Because they actually experienced the highest tension there is in chess. They played the candidates. Occasionally, if you get Carlsen doing some analysis, you actually see what he sees, and he often misses stuff. In fact, he misses a lot, but some people just don't like to see that because, people actually buy into this thing called cult of personality, so they don't find fault in anyone. But as far as I checked, everyone's human, and if not, well, we got to do the procedure then. So, any case, knight a4, knight b1, c4 is pretty good. Now, you may actually notice that we talked about this idea of c4 break, and once we sort of discussed this, you kind of actually went in the direction of playing in that vein. So you already knew something, and that's why it's so good to train with other people. So h3 is somewhat of a hesitant move. You can actually see it on the clock there, that White spent oceans of time making no decision. This is actually a typical human choice, having so many options, deciding not to decide anything. bishop h7, bishop d3. Now, does any of you ever read the title of a book?
Sure.
I do sometimes.
That's the first thing you read.
That's what you're supposed to do. See? In-person chat knows. You've got to read the title of the book. Now, if you actually check the thumbnail, if you haven't, you should. The title was of this lecture, Oh, exploiting positional mistakes. Next time, read the title of the lecture. Now, of course, it might seem unfair, but it's always on YouTube, right? It's out on YouTube what the lecture is about. Right, Ben?
Yes.
So you can find it on St. Louis Chess Club's YouTube. So it's about exploiting positional mistakes. Now, bishop d3 is a very interesting choice. I would be hard-pressed to call it a downright mistake. That would be really harsh, even though I'm considered a harsh person for no particular reason, but maybe they're right. Bishop d3 is very interesting because it tries to get rid of that bishop. However, what do you think is the downside of getting that bishop on d3?
If bishop takes d3, c takes d3, there's no more c4 break.
There's no more c4 break. That's good. We kind of get rid of an idea, but that's clearly something they gave up when they played bishop to d3. Right? It's true, we stopped them from doing that, but there's some other things we have to consider if we decide to capture on d3.
The d pawn's backward doubled and it's a backwards pawn.
So takes, pawn takes. Now white gets an open file, but it's a semi-open file, and we've got a beautiful structure, which is very hard to break through. And they've got a doubled pawn. Now, this is sort of a tricky one because it feels ugly, it looks ugly, yet it ain't delicious. Also, it's not as easy to attack them, because whenever they're on the sides, they're easier to attack. They're in the center, and white has plenty of pieces rotating around to defend them. So you're not going to actually win them quickly, at least. That was a great point, though, that white actually losing out on this idea of c4. What's up?
Well, without the c4 break, though, you have like more or less infinite time to prepare, right?
That we got a lot of time to prepare? For sure. Okay, so that's a good point. Actually, everything slows down a lot. But it does not mean that either side won't have long-term plans. So, white went for bishop d3. Bishop d3 is really a move I would consider risky, strategically risky. Bad? We don't know that yet. Now, why do you think white risked this trade? I'm going to give a hint. This bishop not only was here putting pressure, but it also was a defensive piece. With this trade, it no longer defends a square. And obviously, white is also ambitious and hopes to break through to the other side if he manages. Definitely wants to.
So f5?
This is the square that he tries to get somehow. How can white prepare that?
Go 91.
91? And then?
F4.
And F4. So it does a version of that. Of course, it's black to move. Black goes queen b6. Says, no, 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 no. Wait up. Bishop e3. Knight g6. Now, you see all these signs. I don't like all these signs because just because a computer doesn't like something doesn't make it less playable. Because this bishop does a good job over defending that pawn. Knight h2. And once you sort of have a position where it's somewhat static, so white's plan is fairly straightforward, you can try to play against it. So therefore, Keymer goes bishop e7 and knight h4. Tries to get the knight on f5. Knight f3. Now he decides not to go knight f5 because now these pieces would be defending each other. So the d4 pawn will not fall. So he takes, queen takes. Okay. So we get to this situation and it feels like white is getting really close to pawn to f5. Like really close. How do you think Keymer set up his defenses?
F5.
F5, well, unfortunately, then there's this deadly little check. Whenever you do this, it kind of works if you castled. But here, in this case, I might even check you and just go after these guys. Queen g6. Like check, queen g6. And this is really annoying. But you're right. If we would have been castled already, we could go for f5. But there's an upside to the fact that our king is on e8 and not castled. And that's, again, sort of the beauty of these close positions. There's a little bit of extra flexibility you don't get in any other type of positions. Well, take any of your chances to stop f5.
I mean, I feel like you're leading us towards g6.
g6, yes, of course.
I guess the only way for white to persist would be like g4, which just seems very risky. So maybe it works out.
So rook c2, h5. So this is the other plan that black aims for. This is somewhat passive, but is also pretty good, as you'll see. This is not the most flexible way. The most flexible one would be if we would get two moves in to do f5, castles f5. This is much more solid than the g6, h5 one. Hope something happened, but we're going to get there. So the castles f5 is much more solid. g6, h5 is the plan that you want to sort of avoid in most cases. This is sort of the most basic form of defense from black, but it doesn't mean it's not necessarily a good defense. h5, g3. Now, if white would go g4, already that would give a game plan for black. It already would give us an idea of what white is intending to do. But after g3, we're sort of at odds and we don't know exactly what either side is going to do. But we're playing black here. So what sort of plan or moves could we consider for Keymer?
There's nothing happening on
You could definitely queenside castle. However, I might remind you there's still a couple of pieces lurking over there. I'm not saying long castles is unreasonable, but to be honest, I might even consider sacrificing the pawn. It's something that they often do. You just give a pawn in front of your opponent's king and say, YOLO, I'm just going to attack you. And even if it's not 100% correct, practically speaking, there is compensation. Now, if you recall, exploiting weaknesses, exploiting the little glitches in your opponent's position.
Yeah, I mean, D3 is weak. D3 is weak.
D3 is weak, but you're sort of looking for your opponent's mistake, but we already had a game plan, right? From the outset, we had a plan. Which was connected to the A5 pawn push, right? That was our main idea, my idea that he actually played in this game, A5. And he is actually using it, push that pawn to A3, pawn to B3, and now because of this pawn structure, we got to control something that we usually don't control.
You have the B2 square.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, you want to control and get to squares.
Yeah, I mean,
You can't quite get to B2, unfortunately.
So can we push c5 now and then try to if we exchange the bishops and try to get our knight into
So-
the game?
I like your idea of getting your knight into the game, but if c5, I might have knight a4. Like just double attacking you.
What about knight to B8?
Knight b8.
Going for A6.
Why do you want to put your knight on the side?
Maybe you can get to B4.
Exactly. Knight b8. Very, very strong move by Vincent. This knight is headed towards the b4 square. And that's actually sort of the beauty of his game, and this game in particular. This knight would never have that square controlled if not for this a5, a4, a3 pawn push. g4, knight a6. Now neither of these question marks make any sense. All of the play from both sides is fairly logical. g4, to be honest, you could question that, but oftentimes people are at odds what to do. This seems the most logical. f5, hg, hg, king d7. And king d7 is a brilliant move, despite whatever is written there. Why? Because it connects the rooks, and actually gives the option of rotating between going back to e8 or going to the queen side. So it's fairly open-ended. f6, bishop b4. And f6 is sort of admitting that things are going bad for white. Because if trades, suddenly your king is in danger. And that's actually the whole point of this g6, h5, and these trades. The whole point is that I'm going to explode your king side, and actually the hunter gets hunted. White goes f6, bishop b4, knight a5, queen b5, bishop c1. Now, bishop c1 is somewhat of a mysterious move. It's probably more of a move of desperation than anything else.
Is it just to defend d3?
Probably, but it's still not, I'd rather
I
put
don't
this.
love playing it. So
Yeah,
you can
yeah. Now, we may still want to realize some plans in this position, because let's not forget, it's still mostly about maneuvering than anything concrete. So any ideas regarding maneuvers is more than welcome.
I really want to double up the rooks.
Yeah, there's of course nothing wrong with doubling up the rooks. You can't quite go here because of bishop g5 ideas.
I was thinking bishop b5. I was also thinking though, what if like maybe white, after we move the rook, they just go like rook h2 or something.
You can try to do that, but I mean, it's just a move. There's nothing wrong with either of them.
I still would like to get the knight to b4 if possible. We need to vacate the square. The bishop is occupying b4.
So I get the idea of trying to get this bishop, but if I move here, you give away this square.
I had a different idea actually. Is a prelude to my idea. So
Okay.
I was actually thinking queen a5.
Queen a5.
e5, and then when the knight moves, we can actually trade bishop for knight, and then we will have the b4 square.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting, of going queen a5, b5. He does go queen a5. b5, so one of the things, and you kind of will see the big regret for white, for pushing pawns in front of the king. Same thing with b5. I actually like your move, but not particularly because of b5. I feel that queen a5 is sort of an understanding that, hey, I might be able to use this square, or maybe my queen is just much better here than it is on b5. With b5, your king might get a little off. Not that you can't get away with it, your position is that strong. So king g2, rook h7. But again, I like the fact that he makes sure that he puts the queen on the best position possible, and then do what Natasha suggested, go rook h7. Bishop e3, rook doubles, bishop g1. And for now, it feels that fun times are over. But not so, because we still got reinforcements. How can we still reinforce white's position? I mean, black's. White's position, they reinforced as much as they could.
Knight c7.
You can go knight c7. And we can go for knight b5. But again, notice sort of the trajectory of your own play. It often is an indication if you're doing something right. But even if you're not doing the perfect plan, if you start playing for one specific goal, try to continue on that very same road. Doubled up the rooks. It didn't quite win because the bishop stopped us. Is there a way we could help that out? Help those two rookers?
We go rook h3, and if queen takes, rook takes, king takes, we have the queen. We've traded off some of our pieces, and thematically with less space, that should help us out a little.
Yeah, you could consider rook h3, but I mean, that would still feel more like jumping into action instead of preparing.
Could you bring the queen back, maybe to d8, preparing to
Very good. Just bringing in the lady just to come on over. Knight c5. Probably, so I'm not saying, and this is one of those disclaimers I should always say, just because they didn't go knight c7 doesn't mean it's bad. They just sort of decided for the other plan. Here, the upside of leaving the knight here is that it kind of defended against these jumps. Now we'll have that square. Obviously, we trade the bishop. And now again, we kind of get this good knight versus bad bishop type of position. We, of course, go knight b4, queen f8. Queen is coming over. d4. And should we continue? Very good. Again, notice, of course, we respond to all those threats and checks, but if anything unchanged, we follow the plan of rerouting our lady, and we're going after that pawn on g4. Now, not to mention there's some nasty checks back there. Rook f2, queen g5, and again, notice the fact that if white would have a pawn on g3, it would be actually much more difficult to decide who's for favor. Probably still black, because obviously we got the open file and everything else. But with this pawn being awfully weak and the king completely exposed, there's no question that black is on the verge of winning. So queen f4. What? That's not... Queen c3 happened. So unfortunately, that went that way. King f2. And, well, king f2 might be inaccurate, but the next move actually clinches the game. White was probably hoping that that knight is going to fall and they get extremely close to this king. But it's a bit too far and too late. Black to move and win.
Knight a2 is an interesting idea. Knight a2, rook takes a2. There could be rook h2 with a skewer.
That's interesting. Yeah.
You have like the passed a pawn to sort of work with.
H2. But just look at the king side for white. We can actually set up the perfect storm with all those terrible pieces. The bishop, the rooks actually perfectly blocking everything. There's no clear way out for that king.
Queen f4.
Queen f4, in that case, I actually run. Like you go here, I go here.
Would it be the other way? Would it be queen h4?
If you go queen h4, I manage to block you. But you're sort of trying the right directions, like check. Of course, the king runs. Issue 1, king is running away. Queen h4, issue 2, the queen can block that. So the main point will be is to disallow white from going queen g3.
Rook h3.
Yep, rook h3. I have to take. Here, of course, game ended, but
And
let's say
queen
take.
h4 and there's no king e1.
Queen h4, king g2, and mates. Yep. So a beautiful, beautiful strategic game by Vincent Keymer. You may have noticed that, of course, he went on with his a5, a4, a3 plan, but he made sure to pay attention to the early aggressions of Kraemer, of going f4, g4, and made sure that there's some g6, h5s to stop that attack, and in fact, at the end of the day, manage to win by exploiting these weaknesses. So thank you so much for coming, and really hope you enjoyed this lecture.